Damaged Defenders by Sherza. Chapter 60. Charles and Hank. The efficiency of the rumor mill in the mansion never failed to amuse Charles. It generally took at worst an hour for news to reach every ear, and that was without the aid of the resident telepaths using their skills to either obtain or disseminate the information. So he had not been surprised in the least when, less than a half hour after he'd gotten the call from Agent Coulson, Bobby was in his office door asking if he could go to the tower with Charles. Charles hadn't been about to say no. Until Logan's arrival, Bobby had been all that had been holding John here and keeping John's bitter anger to a dull roar. Knowing, as he did, that his own friendship with Eric had been all that had kept Eric from going off the rails right from the start, Charles wasn't about to interfere with Bobby and John's friendship. He just hoped their friendship would not end the way his and Eric's had. He, Hank, and Bobby left the mansion directly after breakfast. Getting to the tower was still problematic. The repair crews and general citizenry were doing their best, but the damage had been fairly extensive, and 2 weeks was not nearly enough time to do much more than fill in the worst of the potholes from the aliens' guns and get the biggest of the debris, the aliens, and their equipment out of the streets. There were still numerous smaller, for given value of small considering the largest was car-sized, potholes in the streets, piles of smaller debris, and repair crews making the streets difficult to negotiate. At least there were now travel routes open to the affected areas, however serpentine they might be. Despite all of that, they made fairly good time, and were greeted by Tony himself. Charles, Hank, Bobby, Tony greeted. Bobby, John, and Rogue were on the common floor. You get access to it. Bobby immediately tore off, eager to see his friend and girlfriend. Once he was out of earshot, Tony glanced at the other two. Hank, Cecilia, and Frigga are on the quarantine lab floor. It's looking more and more like we're just going to take him to Asgard and let them dig the crap out of him. Their surgical methods beat ours by a few miles. Unfortunately, they never worked with a human before, so you and Cecilia will still be acting as consultants. Tony sighed. The main reason it's probably going to be Asgard is Jarvis has monitored several transmissions aimed in the poor bastard's general direction. They might be trying to activate the stuff they put in him. Just blind luck he's where he's at. That lab is shielded against everything, incoming and outgoing. Unfortunately, turning it into a surgical suite is impossible. Hank looked momentarily angry on the behalf of Sergeant Barnes, then nodded and immediately headed off. Once he too was gone, Tony shot Charles a look. How do you want to work this? Talk to the gang first, or her? I believe that talking to the team first would probably be better, Charles said. Depending on how difficult your captive is, I might not have the energy after I'm done attempting to work with her. Right, most of the gang is on the common floor, Tony said, trying to distract themselves. We haven't been able to budge Cap off the lab floor. How he's still holding it together, I really don't know. When he crashes, it's not going to be pretty. Tony snorted. What am I saying? It's already been ugly. I did not know Spangles could get that pissed off. Charles cocked an eyebrow in question. Let's put it this way. He made Natasha flinch, Tony told him. And Logan. Well, that was somewhat alarming. Charles didn't know Natasha personally, of course, but she was rather legendary for her calm and fearlessness in the face of anything and everything. Logan, he knew better. Well enough to know the man did not flinch for any reason, much less due to being intimidated by another person. Perhaps I should start there, then, Charles said, and the two of them made their way to the elevator. By the time they got there, Hank was deep in conference with Cecilia and another woman that Charles assumed was Frigga, given Tony's earlier comments, to one side of a heavy metal door. They were looking at a screen that was displaying the back and head of a man's sans skin, with several spots along the spine and skull glowing a malevolent purple. Charles presumed the display was a rendering of Sergeant Barnes' body and the items that required removal. Captain Rogers was, quite literally, sitting on the floor just outside that heavy door, watching a second screen. Watching the screen for a few moments, Charles could not fault Steve for his angry, heartbroken expression. The screen showed the interior of the lab, where Sergeant Barnes was being held. Barnes was just standing, more or less, in the center of the room, unmoving, face blank of all expression. He hasn't moved at all, Tony said, surprisingly quiet for a man who could attract and keep the attention of thousands effortlessly. Either of them. Charles rolled closer to Steve, careful to keep his telepathy to himself. He didn't really need to peek right now, anyway. What Steve was feeling was written all over his face. The challenge there wasn't figuring out how Steve felt, but getting him to actually talk about it. Charles wasn't even going to hope for that just yet. He decided to settle for successfully getting Steve off the floor, in both senses of the word. Captain? Steve? It took a second, but Steve tore his attention away from the screen he'd been watching. You're not going to do Sergeant Barnes a bit of good if you collapse from lack of food and sleep, Charles said quietly. Steve gave him a mulish look. Charles suppressed a wholly inappropriate spurt of amusement at how juvenile the expression made Steve appear. Just then, he'd looked no older than most of Charles's students. Then again, he might just be able to use that against Steve. Come now. I'd expect such an expression from my students, not a grown adult, Charles said, which got him a deeper glower. You know I'm talking sense. At the very least, you need to eat. As fast as your metabolism works, I'm surprised your stomach isn't already snarling at you. That got him a somewhat guilty look, then a much put upon sigh. Fine. I suppose I gotta. Steve grumbled. Good lord, but it really was like dealing with his students. Charles did still manage to chivvy Steve to the common floor and the kitchen there. With food in his immediate line of sight, Steve's hunger finally took precedence over his concern for his friend. Steve lost no further time in fixing himself something to eat and drink. While he was thus engaged, Charles motored out of the kitchen area and towards the entertainment area where the vast majority of the Avengers were gathered. Bobby, John, and Rogue had withdrawn and were talking animatedly among themselves far enough away from the entertainment area that their chatter wouldn't disturb the movie watchers. The rest were, purportedly, watching a movie. One of the ones that had more explosions and action than sensible plot. While everyone was facing that general direction, it was pretty clear their attention was not on the movie. While Charles was not explicitly an empath, it didn't take any talent at all, never mind a mutation, to define the general mood of the room, and in many cases, the mood of the individuals in it. Time to get to work. Hank was working very hard to not growl. He'd lost little time in getting to the quarantine lab floor to assess the situation with Sergeant Barnes. He was willing to admit, been rather thoroughly diverted temporarily upon his arrival. First by the sight of Captain Rogers sitting on the floor watching one of Tony's computer screens with the most woebegone expression Hank had ever seen on a human's face. Then, by the presence of Cecilia and a dignified blonde woman he did not know, who introduced herself as Freya. It had taken all of Hank's not inconsiderable willpower to keep the 10,001 questions he wanted to ask behind his teeth. Now was not the time to inquire about Asgard and his people, however much he might want to. Given that Freya was from an entirely different world, it did not surprise Hank that she did not react negatively to his appearance. It was entirely possible she had seen much odder things in her time than a man covered in blue fur. That said, given how rare such acceptance was here on Earth, Hank still found it unusual and rather delightful. The three of them quickly lost themselves in consulting over the medical challenges Sergeant Barnes presented. That was what was making Hank want to growl so badly. The hardware along Sergeant Barnes' spine and under his skull proved to be computer chips, attached to surprisingly tiny power sources after a far more in-depth scan by Jarvis. Worryingly, the power sources also seemed to serve as a means by which to kill the sergeant if he ever escaped his controllers, as all of them were capable of exploding. Hank really couldn't figure out which he should be angrier about. That the things existed at all, or that they could kill him with the flick of a switch. Cecilia, despite her excellent skills, was not a neurosurgeon. Trauma surgeons could, by virtue of what they were and were expected to deal with, manage a lot of surgical procedures. Neurosurgery of any description, however, was not something they knew how to perform. Under normal circumstances in a trauma situation, if someone required surgery of that sort, they were handed over to a neurosurgeon. While Hank had little doubt that Tony could and would bring in the best neurosurgeon on the planet to work on Sergeant Barnes, they were trying to keep the knowledge of what they were doing and to whom within the tower. Regardless of oaths taken or money paid, people could be forced to speak by any of a variety of means. There was also the complication that any neurosurgeon they brought in would be unlikely to have any familiarity with working on someone with an atypical body. Their scans were making it quite clear that Sergeant Barnes had been modified at some point with a bastardized version of the serum that had enhanced Captain Rogers. Sergeant Barnes' vital statistics were not to the captain's level, but they were above the human norm. Sergeant Barnes' modifications seemed to have focused not on physical perfection, but on stamina, endurance, and healing. Insofar as Hank was able to determine, Sergeant Barnes had not gained in height or muscle mass. His metabolism, while faster than normal, was roughly half that of the captain's. The sergeant's ability to heal, however, nearly equaled that of Logan and was much faster than the captain, who, in keeping with his metabolism, healed about 4 times faster than a normal human. The source of the differences could be any of a number of things. The likeliest was, of course, a difference in the make and or application of the serum. There was also the possibility that the conditions under which it had been applied, meaning as a method of torture, since the likeliest time for Sergeant Barnes to have been exposed to the serum was during his incarceration at the hands of Hydra, had had an impact. It could also be because Sergeant Barnes started out far more optimized than Captain Rogers did when the serum was applied, so less work had needed to be done to optimize his body. The other matter making Hank want to growl was the sergeant's prosthetic arm. While it was without a doubt a technological wonder well ahead of its time, and something that under other circumstances Tony would be deeply jealous of, it was also an abomination. The good news was that whoever had attached the arm had not removed all of the sergeant's arm and shoulder. The arm had been amputated roughly halfway between shoulder and elbow, but the rest remained. Better still, the job had been done correctly rather than just hacking it off and leaving it at that. That was unfortunately where the good news ended. The arm, aside from containing empty spaces clearly meant for armaments to be emplaced, also had a compartment in the armpit area that concealed containers filled with, well, they weren't sure what, but given the situation, it couldn't be anything good for the sergeant. These containers fed directly into the stump, feeding their contents into the sergeant's system. Fortunately, the containers would run dry within a half day at their current rate of use. Unfortunately, that added the high probability of dealing with the sergeant being in withdrawal to their already intimidating list of his problems. There was an added complication in that the arm was connected to Sergeant Barnes' nervous system to allow him to move and manipulate it as one would the arm one was born with. The leads that attached the arm to his nervous system were attached at a number of points on the stump and in the shoulder, and would require a very fine hand indeed to remove them without causing the sergeant nerve damage. Worse than that, however, was the fact that the arm had been grafted to the sergeant's shoulder and rib cage. While it could still be removed by their own surgical means, the likelihood of the sergeant dying in the process was ridiculously high. The odds of them managing to stop the bleeding before he bled out, remove the leads without damaging his nerves, putting in bone grafts where they had no choice but to remove bone, fortunately only a couple of fairly small spots, but still, get skin grafts on to protect the newly exposed muscle and bone and keep infection at bay, were minuscule. Something was bound to go wrong somewhere, and with extensive as the procedure would have to be, the odds of the sergeant dying on the table were far higher than Hank and Cecilia were comfortable with. In short, Hank could well see why Cecilia was leaning towards Sergeant Barnes being taken to Asgard to get everything removed. As Frigga described their surgical methods, they could remove and fix everything save the missing portion of the sergeant's arm, with virtually no risk of death and literally no risk of infection. Their only problem lay in the fact that the sergeant was not Asgardian, so they did not know how to set up their medical equipment such that the sergeant would remain unconscious for the procedure. The question remained was when the sergeant would go. Hank was of the opinion that they needed to wait both for the drugs in the arm to run dry and for any withdrawal to run its course. This would also give Tony more time to build a replacement arm so that the sergeant need not go without or undergo a second surgical procedure, though that was unlikely, to attach the new arm. Cecilia agreed with him. Frigga, on the other hand, was of the opinion that they ought to bring the sergeant to Asgard now. We can keep him comfortable while the drugs and withdrawal run their courses, Frigga said, and our metalsmiths would be pleased to donate their work areas and supplies to Tony for the creation of a new arm. We also have metals that are far lighter and stronger than that of the arm he has now. There would be no need for it to be anchored to shoulder and side, were it created with Asgardian metals, and it would not damage easily, and the sergeant would be well beyond the reach of all who would attempt to harm or reclaim him. Well, there was that, Hank thought, because whoever had held him would eventually attempt to regain their lost asset. And while Hank knew the Avengers were fully capable and more than willing of stopping any such attempts, avoiding them entirely would likely be the better course. Let's go talk to Tony. We'll need him on board for this, Hank finally said. But other than that, you raise good points.